Chapter 1. The village of St. Hilary had always prided itself on being a place of tranquillity, where the most scandalous event in recent memory had been the vicar's cat going missing for 2 days, before turning up asleep in Mrs. Weatherby's airing cupboard. Life moved at a steady pace, unbothered by the noise of the outside world. The residents took comfort in their routines, the morning deliveries from the bakery, the weekly meetings of the Ladies' Garden Society, and of course, the much-anticipated annual Harvest Festival. The festival, held in the grand old St. Hilary's Parish Hall, was the highlight of the season. The church was adorned with garlands of dried wheat, ivy, and golden autumn leaves, while long wooden tables groaned under the weight of homemade jams, fresh-baked scones, and prize-winning preserves. The air was thick with the mingling scents of spiced cider, roasted chestnuts, and the faint, ever-present hint of lavender from Mrs. Dunworthy's overuse of cologne. Miss Jane Marple sat at her usual place, on a sturdy wooden chair near the window, where she had an excellent view of the hall. She was a small elderly lady, her sharp blue eyes hidden behind delicate lace gloves as she sipped her tea. While others in the village saw only the merry festival around them, Miss Marple saw something else entirely. She saw people. There was Mrs. Letitia Fairbrother, the wealthy widow who held court near the raffle table, her fingers glittering with rings that caught the candlelight. Her voice, sharp and confident, carried over the hum of conversation as she regaled a captive audience with yet another tale of her late husband's success in the cotton trade. Across the hall, Reverend Leonard Fanshawe conversed with Major Archibald Danforth, a retired military officer with a chest full of medals and a tendency to overstate his exploits in India. The two men spoke in hushed tones, though every now and then the Major's booming laughter broke through. And then, of course, there was Charlotte Simmons. Charlotte was young, strikingly beautiful, and far too aware of her own charm. She had arrived in St. Hilary only 6 months ago, securing employment as the personal secretary of Mr. James Radcliffe, a reclusive gentleman who had recently taken up residence in the grand yet neglected Fairview Manor. Despite her short time in the village, Charlotte had stirred more than a few whispers. Some admired her, some envied her, and others did not trust her at all. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, allowed herself a small smile. A village was like a pond, still on the surface, but if one looked closely, there were always ripples beneath, the scream that shattered the evening. The evening had been proceeding pleasantly enough. Jovial conversations, friendly laughter, the occasional sound of a spoon clinking against a teacup. Then the scream came. It wasn't just any scream. It was the sort that sent an icy shiver down one's spine. A sound of pure, unfiltered terror. The hall fell into stunned silence. Heads turned toward the source of the commotion, the narrow corridor that led to the cloakroom at the back of the church. A few moments later, a voice, trembling and barely above a whisper, echoed through the space. Someone call the police!" Miss Marple rose from her seat with practised ease, her expression calm. While the rest of the guests remained frozen in shock, she made her way toward the commotion. The crowd parted before her as she approached the vestibule. There, amidst the neatly arranged coats and scarves, lay the crumpled form of Charlotte Simmons. Her golden hair, usually styled to perfection, was dishevelled. Her once vibrant lips were parted in a silent gasp, her face pale and expression frozen in an odd mixture of fear and surprise. And beside her, stark against the polished wooden floor, lay a single crimson glove. The air in the room grew thick with whispers. Mrs. Fairbrother gasped, clutching her pearls. Reverend Fanshawe muttered a hurried prayer, while Major Danforth let out a low, stunned whistle. Miss Marple knelt beside the fallen woman, her gloved fingers brushing against the edge of the crimson glove. Her sharp eyes flicked over the scene. The way Charlotte's body lay, the faint scent of expensive perfume still clinging to her dress, the peculiar absence of any visible wounds. "She's not breathing," murmured Dr. Morton, the village physician, as he gently touched Charlotte's wrist. His face was grim. "She's dead." A fresh wave of gasps. "But how?" Mrs. Fairbrother exclaimed. "There's no blood, no sign of struggle." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the crimson glove. There was something decidedly odd about it. Most people would see it as a simple misplaced item. Miss Marple saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. The village reacts it did not take long for the entire village to descend into a frenzy of speculation. By the time Inspector Graves arrived, a stern man with a keen sense for detail and a deep mistrust of small-town gossip, the church hall was abuzz with theories. "A heart attack, perhaps?" suggested Reverend Fanshawe. "The poor girl always seemed rather excitable." "Nonsense!" scoffed Mrs. Fairbrother. "It must have been poison. I read about something similar in a detective novel once." "No, no," said Major Danforth, stroking his moustache thoughtfully. "This has all the marks of a classic revenge killing. Someone wanted her dead." Miss Marple remained silent, listening. She had long ago learned that if one listened carefully enough, people often revealed more than they intended. Inspector Graves turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "You, Miss Marple, you always seem to notice things others don't. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple smiled, a gentle grandmotherly smile that concealed the sharp mind beneath. "Oh, Inspector, I wouldn't dream of interfering," she said, lightly. "I am merely an observer." But she was already making mental notes. Charlotte Simons had not died of natural causes. Someone in this village had wanted her dead, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. Chapter 2. The Body of Charlotte. Simons had been removed from the vestibule, but the shadow of her death lingered in the grand hall of St. Hilary's parish. Conversations had turned from cheerful festival chatter to hushed, urgent whispers. The scent of spiced apple cider and fresh scones now felt oddly misplaced, in an atmosphere thick with shock and suspicion. Miss Marple remained seated near this tea-table, hands gently clasped in her lap, observing the ripples of unease spreading through the villagers. Death had a way of loosening tongues. People, when rattled, often revealed things they might otherwise keep hidden. Across the room, Inspector Graves stood near the entrance, his weathered face set in a deep frown. He was a man of calculated patience and sharp instincts, accustomed to city crimes where motives were blatant and evidence was tangible. But small villages, he knew, were a different matter entirely. Here, crime was tangled in gossip, old grievances and secrets buried under decades of polite conversation. "Right then," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. No one is to leave until we've taken statements. This is a murder investigation, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." The word murder sent a fresh ripple of gasps through the crowd. Some of the ladies instinctively pressed handkerchiefs to their lips, while Major Danforth let out a low whistle. Miss Marple observed the reactions closely. Guilt often didn't show itself in words, but in the flicker of an eye, a nervous twitch, a too calm demeanour. The inspector turned toward the village doctor, Dr. Morton, who had examined Charlotte's body before the constable arrived. "Morton," he said gruffly, "do we know the cause of death yet?" Dr. Morton hesitated. There were no visible injuries, no wounds, no bruising. Her face was frozen in surprise. "My guess? Poison. But until I conduct a proper examination, I can't be certain." The villagers erupted into anxious murmurs. "Poison!" Mrs. Fairbrother exclaimed, pressing a hand to her chest. "How dreadful! Who on earth would do such a thing?" "Well," said Major Danforth, his moustache twitching, not to speak ill of the dead, but the young woman did have a talent for making enemies. Miss Marple caught the sharp glance Inspector Graves gave the Major. It was the kind of glance that said, "Go on." Danforth sighed, shifting his weight. "I don't mean to say she deserved it, of course. But you must admit, she stirred trouble wherever she went. She had a way of toying with people." A few heads nodded in agreement. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Dunworthy, a usually mild-mannered woman, fidgeting with her wedding ring, a nervous gesture. "Toying with whom, exactly?" the inspector asked. "Take your pick," Danforth said dryly. "There was Mr. Radcliffe, her employer, of course, and young Timothy White. Poor boy was smitten with her, but she never took him seriously. Then there was Mrs. Fairbrother's nephew, Henry. Last week I saw them quarrelling outside the post office. And of course one mustn't forget." His voice trailed off, eyes flickering across the room. Miss Marple followed his gaze. Eleanor Harding. The village schoolteacher stood near the back of the hall, her hands clenched at her sides. She had been quiet since the body was found, her face unusually pale. Miss Marple took note. Suspicious behaviour, in her experience, often came in two forms: those who spoke too much and those who spoke too little. "Miss Harding," Inspector Graves called, "did you have any quarrel with Charlotte Simmons?" Eleanor blinked rapidly. "No, of course not. Why would you ask such a thing? You were friends, were you not?" A long silence. "We knew each other," Eleanor said finally, her voice measured. "We weren't particularly close." "Yet," Graves pressed, "I was told Charlotte stayed with you for the first 2 weeks when she arrived in the village." Miss Marple saw Eleanor's fingers tighten slightly. "Ah, that was months ago," Eleanor said stiffly. "I don't see what that has to do with her death." "Everything is relevant in an investigation," Graves replied smoothly. "And it would be rather helpful if you told us why you stopped being friendly." Eleanor hesitated. The pause was just a second too long. She was charming, Eleanor admitted finally, but she wasn't trustworthy. A silence settled over the room. Miss Marple watched Eleanor carefully, the way her shoulders tensed, the way she avoided looking at Mrs. Fairbrother's nephew, Henry, who had suddenly gone very still. Yes, There was a story here, a hidden clue just then. A constable entered the hall, holding something in his gloved hands. "Sir," he said, addressing the inspector, "we found this in the cloakroom, tucked behind the benches." He unwrapped a delicate silk scarf. The villagers leaned in. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. It was Charlotte's scarf. A faint, nearly imperceptible stain marked one corner, a pale, powdery residue. Dr. Morton stepped forward and took the fabric between his fingers, rubbing the stained section. He sniffed lightly, then frowned. This smells of bitter almonds." Another collective gasp. Inspector Graves's expression darkened. "Cyanide," he muttered. "It was poison, then." Miss Marple sighed softly. She had suspected as much. Now the real question remained. Who had poisoned Charlotte Simons? And why? Chapter 3. The discovery of cyanide had sent a fresh wave of unease through the crowd. Poison. The very word carried a sense of deliberation, calculation. This was not a crime of passion or sudden violence. It was cold. Pre-planned murder Miss Marple, seated quietly near the tea-table, observed the shifting dynamics of the room. Panic had begun to take hold of the villagers. Whispered conversations, wary glances. People mentally reassessing their relationships with Charlotte Simons. Inspector Graves, his face set in a stern expression, turned back to the small group near the doorway. "This was no accident. Someone in this hall is responsible, and I intend to find out who." A tense silence followed. The sound of the wind rattling against the stained glass windows filled the space. Finally, Mrs. Fairbrother broke the silence. "I don't understand," she said, voice trembling slightly. "How was she poisoned? She was perfectly fine before she went to the cloakroom." Miss Marple tapped a delicate finger against the rim of her teacup. That was the question, wasn't it? Charlotte Simons had been in high spirits all evening. She had laughed, she had spoken to people, she had eaten and drank. So, when did she ingest the poison? Dr. Morton, rubbing his temples, answered, "Cyanide acts quickly. If she died in the cloakroom, it means she must have taken it only minutes before her collapse. Then the poison must have been in something she ate or drank," cried Mrs. Dunworthy. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flickered over to the refreshment table. The half-empty cups of tea, the untouched slices of cake, the neat rows of jam tarts. "No," she murmured more to herself than anyone else. "Not in the food. She was careful. Charlotte Simons was a woman who understood danger." She turned to the inspector. "Forgive me, Inspector, but may I ask, where exactly was that crimson glove found?" The constable stepped forward. "Just beside the body, ma'am." "And did anyone see her wearing it before she went to the cloakroom?" There was a pause. No one answered. Miss Marple smiled softly. There, a missing link. The last drink Inspector Graves, catching on, turned toward Henry Fairbrother, Mrs. Fairbrother's nephew. "You were seen speaking with Charlotte before she left the hall," Graves said. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Henry, a thin, nervous-looking young man, swallowed hard. "No, nothing at all. We only spoke for a moment." "About what?" Henry hesitated. "Too long." Miss Marple saw the small beads of sweat forming at his temple. She asked me to get her a drink," he admitted finally. "She said she had a headache. I poured her a glass of water from the jug by the window. She drank it quickly, then excused herself to the cloakroom. Silence. Miss Marple sighed. Ah, that explains it. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Explains what, exactly, Miss Marple? She glanced at him kindly, as if he were a particularly slow student. You see, Inspector, Charlotte's death wasn't a matter of when she was poisoned, but how. The whole room listened intently. She didn't eat anything before leaving, but she drank the water. Henry's face turned ashen. I didn't put anything in it. I dare say you didn't, Miss Marple said soothingly. But someone did, and whoever poisoned Charlotte must have known she would ask for water, which means... Inspector Graves' face darkened. The poison was already in the glass. A web of suspects, Henry, visibly shaking now, stepped back. I swear, I didn't touch the glass before pouring the water. The inspector raised an eyebrow. Then who did? The room was silent. People looked at one another, some nervously, others suspiciously. Miss Marple took the moment to observe everyone's reactions. This was always the most telling part of a murder investigation. Mrs. Fairbrother kept adjusting her pearl necklace, a nervous tick. Eleanor Harding's hands were clenched into tight fists. Major Danforth was staring at the floor, unusually quiet. Reverend Fanshawe was holding his Bible a little too tightly, and Mr. James Radcliffe, Charlotte's employer, had not said a single word. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. Right. Until we determine the circumstances of the poisoning, I'll need to question everyone who interacted with Charlotte before her death. Mrs. Dunworthy let out a dramatic gasp. You mean we're all suspects? Graves gave her a pointed look. At the moment, yes. A murmur of protests erupted. Miss Marple, however, was still watching Mr. Radcliffe. Unlike the others, he didn't protest. He simply stood there, his face unreadable. Interesting. A woman who knew too much. The inspector began taking names, jotting them down in a small notebook. Miss Marple continued to sip her tea, turning over the facts in her mind. Charlotte Simons had arrived in St. Hilary only 6 months ago. She had quickly made both friends and enemies. She had worked for James Radcliffe, and now she was dead. Miss Marple had seen this pattern before. A newcomer arrives in a quiet village. The community welcomes them, but slowly tensions build. There are secrets the village does not want uncovered, and sometimes the newcomer uncovers them anyway. Perhaps Charlotte had learned something. She wasn't supposed to. Perhaps someone had wanted her silent. Her eyes drifted once more to the crimson glove. A message or a mistake. She placed her cup down gently. Yes, this was going to be a very interesting case. Chapter 4. The storm outside had begun to pick up, the wind howling through the old stained-glass windows of St. Hilary's Parish Hall. Inside, the air remained thick with suspicion and uncertainty. The villagers, once caught up in the joyful spirit of the harvest festival, were now shifting uncomfortably under the weight of a murder investigation. Miss Marple, seated in her usual unassuming manner, observed the way people reacted to Inspector Graves's questioning. The guilty always revealed themselves, not in confessions, but in how they behaved under scrutiny. Some were too loud in their innocence, others too silent. Some deflected suspicion, while others shrank into the background. And then there were those who simply watched, Like James Radcliffe, the reclusive businessman had, so far, said nothing. He had remained by the window, his arms folded, his expression impassive, as the questioning unfolded around him. Miss Marple knew his type. A man with secrets, the last conversation. Mr. Radcliffe. Inspector Graves finally said, snapping his notebook shut. You were Charlotte Simmons's employer. What can you tell me about her? A pause, a fraction too long. She was competent, Radcliffe said at last, his voice measured. Competent. The inspector raised an eyebrow. That's a rather cold description of someone who worked closely with you for 6 months. Radcliffe gave a small shrug. I hired Charlotte to manage my affairs. She did her job. That was all. Miss Marple saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not grief, not even surprise. Relief. Interesting. Did you have any disagreements with her? Graves pressed. Radcliffe's jaw tightened slightly. Not that I recall. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. A deliberate lie. That's odd, Graves said, flipping through his notes. Because according to Mrs. Dunworthy, she saw the two of you in a rather heated conversation outside the post office just 3 days ago. Radcliffe's face remained carefully neutral. It was a work matter. Nothing significant. Miss Marple gently cleared her throat. Forgive me, Mr. Radcliffe, but I do wonder, what sort of work matter makes a young woman look as pale as Charlotte did that day? Radcliffe flinched, only for a second. But Miss Marple saw it. Before he could answer, the constable entered the hall once more, carrying a small black notebook. Sir, he said to Graves, holding it out, this was found in Miss Simmons's handbag. Seems like a personal diary. A murmur swept through the room. Miss Marple observed how the colour drained from Radcliffe's face. Inspector Graves took the notebook, flipping through its pages. The room was silent as he scanned the delicate, slanted handwriting. And then he stopped. Slowly, he turned the book around for the room to see. The last entry, dated just 1 day ago, read, I know the truth now. He's been lying all along. I need to confront him, but I have to be careful. If he knows I found out, I might not be safe. A fresh wave of whispers erupted. Who? Mrs. Fairbrother gasped. Who was she talking about? Inspector Graves turned his gaze toward Radcliffe. You tell me, he said coolly. A man with secrets exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous. Is it? Graves stepped forward. She was planning to confront someone. Someone she knew was hiding something. And now she's dead. Radcliffe clenched his jaw. That doesn't mean it was me. But you do have a secret, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Radcliffe froze. His eyes flickered toward her, wary. What are you talking about? Miss Marple smiled, adjusting the lace cuffs of her gloves. You see, Mr. Radcliffe, I happen to know a little about human nature, and I believe Charlotte discovered something about you, something you didn't want her to know. Radcliffe's hand curled into a fist. You don't know anything. Miss Marple merely tilted her head. Oh, but I do. And so did Charlotte. The question is, was it worth killing for? Silence. Radcliffe's lips pressed into a thin line. I had nothing to do with Charlotte's death. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Then you won't mind telling us what she found out? The room waited, and then, at last, Radcliffe sighed. "It wasn't what you think," he muttered. "Charlotte found some financial records from my old business dealings, things I wanted kept private." "Fraud?" Graves asked sharply. Radcliffe shook his head. "Nothing criminal, just mistakes. Charlotte had a way of digging into things that weren't her concern. She found records that suggested I had lost more money than I admitted when I left London. She thought I was hiding something worse." "And were you?" Radcliffe's gaze was steely. "No," Miss Marple observed him carefully. "He was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Still, this revelation changed things. Was Charlotte's death really about money? Or had she uncovered something even more dangerous? An unexpected admission." Before anyone could speak further, Eleanor Harding let out a soft sound. Almost a whisper. I told her to stop. Everyone turned. Eleanor was pale, her hands shaking slightly. "I told Charlotte to stop asking questions. I told her it wasn't safe." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Ah, now we were getting somewhere." "Why, Eleanor?" Graves asked gently. Eleanor swallowed. "Because I knew she was getting involved in something bigger than she realized." "What do you mean?" Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. Charlotte thought she was playing a game. She liked finding people's weaknesses. She liked uncovering things. She exhaled shakily. But she didn't understand that some secrets aren't meant to be found. A silence stretched between them, and in that silence Miss Marple understood. Charlotte Simmons had been digging, and someone had decided to bury her. The real question was, who? Chapter 5. The hush that had fallen over the parish hall was the kind of silence that bristled with tension. Eleanor Harding had spoken the words without fully realizing their weight. But now that they hung in the air, she looked as if she wished she could take them back. Inspector Graves fixed her with a keen stare. "Miss Harding," he said, voice measured, "are you suggesting that Charlotte Simmons was murdered because of something she uncovered?" Eleanor's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. She licked her lips, looking anywhere but at the inspector. I don't know," she murmured. "I only know that she liked to push people. She liked stirring things up, and not everyone appreciated it." Miss Marple studied her closely. Eleanor's distress seemed genuine, but it wasn't fear of being caught. It was fear of something else entirely. "Who did she push, Eleanor?" Miss Marple asked gently. The room held its breath. Eleanor looked up at last. Her eyes darted toward James Radcliffe. A murmur swept through the room. Radcliffe stiffened, his mouth pressing into a thin line. She was obsessed with Mr. Radcliffe, Eleanor admitted in a whisper. "She told me she was convinced he was lying about something. She wanted to know why he really left London." Radcliffe exhaled sharply. "This is absurd. My reasons for leaving London are no one's business but my own." Miss Marple gave him a mild smile. "Oh, but Mr. Radcliffe, surely you can see how unfortunate this looks. Charlotte Simons begins asking too many questions about you, and suddenly she's dead." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Graves narrowed his eyes. "We know she planned to confront someone about a secret. If that person was you," Radcliffe cut him off. "I didn't kill her." His voice was firm, controlled. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Then who did? Radcliffe hesitated, and that was interesting. He was hiding something. Before he could answer, a loud knocking suddenly echoed through the church hall. All heads turned. A constable stepped inside, shaking the rain off his cap. He carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Sir," he said to Inspector Graves, "we found this in Charlotte Simmons's room at the boarding house." Graves took the parcel, his brow furrowing. He carefully peeled back the paper, revealing a stack of old letters. A gasp went up from the villagers. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Letters, you say?" Graves quickly scanned the topmost letter, his expression darkening. "These," he said grimly, "are letters of blackmail. Secrets worth killing," for a fresh ripple of unease spread through the room. "Blackmail?" Mrs. Fairbrother exclaimed, pressing a hand to her chest. "Charlotte was blackmailing someone?" Graves didn't answer right away. He flipped through the letters, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. Then he looked up at the room. "Charlotte Simons," he said, slowly, "wasn't just asking questions. She was collecting secrets, and she was using them against people." Miss Marple sighed softly. Ah, now it made sense. "She was blackmailing someone in this village," Miss Marple murmured, "and that someone decided to silence her before she could go any further." "Who?" demanded Major Danforth, looking thoroughly rattled. Graves raised an eyebrow. "That's what we're about to find out." He turned back to the letters and selected one at random. He read aloud, "If you don't pay up, I'll tell everyone what I know, and you wouldn't want that, would you?" The villagers stiffened. Graves flipped to the signature at the bottom. There wasn't one. Miss Marple pursed her lips. Clever girl. She didn't sign her name. She was being cautious. But even the cleverest of blackmailers always make mistakes. Graves nodded, which means we'll need to go through these letters carefully, because one of them will lead us to our murderer. A town of suspects. The villagers shifted nervously. Every person in that room had a secret, and Charlotte Simons had known at least one of them. Miss Marple, her sharp eyes sweeping the room, knew that somewhere among these people sat a killer. The question now was simple. Who had the most to lose? Chapter 6. The stack of letters lay on the table like a silent confession, a collection of veiled threats written in Charlotte Simmons' neat, slanted handwriting. The words themselves weren't explicit, but their meaning was clear. She had been blackmailing someone. Miss Marple, seated at the far end of the room, folded her hands in her lap, her gaze moving from face to face. The villagers of St. Hilary were usually a friendly, gossip-loving bunch, but now they all looked uneasy, because now everyone in the room had a reason to be afraid. Inspector Graves flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. "These letters were written over the last few months," he said, "which means Charlotte has been blackmailing more than one person in this village." A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. Miss Marple, however, was not shocked in the slightest. She had long suspected that Charlotte had been playing a dangerous game. She had been the type of woman who thrived on power, influence, and control. But in a place like St. Hilary, where the past was never truly buried and everyone had something to hide, blackmail was a dangerous profession. And now it had cost her life. A name in the letters anything useful in there? asked Major Danforth, his gruff voice breaking the silence. Inspector Graves didn't answer right away. He was flipping through the letters, his eyes scanning the names. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His lips curled into a grim smile. "Ah," he murmured, "here's something." The room held its breath. Graves read aloud. "You think no one knows, but I do. I know what you did. And unless you want the entire village to know too, I suggest you cooperate." There was a pause. And then Graves looked up. His sharp eyes landed on Eleanor Harding. A gasp went up. Eleanor's face went stark white. She started, but her voice failed her. Inspector Graves raised an eyebrow. "Miss Harding, this letter is addressed to you." And Sir Eleanor's fingers trembled at her sides. Her lips parted slightly, but she couldn't seem to form words. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Not guilt, but fear, the kind of fear that came from a secret too big to be spoken aloud. "Eleanor's secret, again? I don't know what she was talking about," Eleanor finally managed, though her voice lacked conviction. Graves wasn't convinced. "Charlotte seemed quite sure you had something to hide." Eleanor shook her head. "I swear, I don't—" She stopped. Her fingers had curled into tight fists. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Eleanor, my dear, if you were being blackmailed, it might be best to tell us why. Secrets have a way of becoming very dangerous when left unspoken." Eleanor's eyes darted toward the villagers, then toward James Radcliffe. Radcliffe. Again, Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath. "Charlotte." "She thought she knew something about me," Eleanor whispered. "But she was wrong." Graves folded his arms. "What did she think she knew?" Eleanor hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. "She thought I was having an affair with James Radcliffe." Another gasp. Miss Marple, however, wasn't surprised. Radcliffe let out a low, humorless chuckle. "That's ridiculous," he said. Eleanor's gaze snapped to him. "I know, but she wouldn't believe me. She thought she could use it against me." Graves frowned. "So, she was threatening you?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "Yes, she told me she had evidence, a letter or something. I told her she was mistaken, but she just laughed." Miss Marple nodded slightly. This made sense. Charlotte hadn't needed the truth to blackmail someone, only the appearance of truth. She had assumed something about Eleanor, and rather than deny it loudly, Eleanor had tried to avoid conflict, and in doing so, she had made herself look guilty. A larger game at play. "But I didn't kill her," Eleanor whispered. Inspector Graves studied her. "Maybe not, but someone did. And if Charlotte was blackmailing you, who else was she blackmailing?" Graves turned back to the stack of letters, flipping through them quickly. Miss Marple already knew the answer. This wasn't about a single person. Charlotte had been playing with fire, and now she had been burned. "Ah!" Graves said suddenly. Hiddu pulled out another letter, and his expression darkened. Miss Marple saw it in an instant. Graves looked up. His gaze landed on Mrs. Fairbrother. Another gasp. Mrs. Fairbrother blinked, looking startled. "Me?" she exclaimed. "That's absurd." Graves lifted the letter. "This one was sent to you." Miss Marple studied Mrs. Fairbrother's reaction, the way her hand instinctively reached for her pearls. A nervous tick, a sign of someone who wasn't. You entirely innocent. A web of deception. This is preposterous. Mrs. Fairbrother huffed. I have nothing to hide. Then why was Charlotte blackmailing you? Graves asked. Mrs. Fairbrother's mouth opened, then closed. Miss Marple smiled softly. My dear Mrs. Fairbrother, we all have secrets. It is simply a matter of which ones are worth killing for. The air in the parish hall grew heavy. Miss Marple could feel it. They were getting close. Charlotte Simons had uncovered something, and one of these people had killed her for it. The real question was, who? Chapter 7, The Tension in St. Hilary's. Parish Hall was thick, almost suffocating. The storm outside had worsened, rattling the stained glass windows as though the heavens themselves were reacting to the secrets being unearthed inside. Mrs. Fairbrother stood frozen, her usual airs of self-importance replaced by a pale and strained expression. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her pearl necklace, a nervous gesture Miss Marple had seen many times before. Inspector Graves, holding the blackmail letter addressed to Mrs. Fairbrother, regarded her with a keen, unrelenting stare. "Would you care to explain, Mrs. Fairbrother?" he asked coolly. A murmur spread through the crowd. The once sociable gathering had transformed into something else entirely, a courtroom of whispers and suspicion. Mrs. Fairbrother scoffed, though the effect was weaker than usual. "Explain what, Inspector?" "That Charlotte Simons had a vivid imagination, that she thought she could manipulate people with her ridiculous little threats." Graves raised an eyebrow. "And did she succeed?" Mrs. Fairbrother's lips pressed together tightly. "She certainly tried," she admitted at last, "but I refused to give in. She had nothing on me." Miss Marple, still sitting comfortably in her chair, observed the very slight tremor in Mrs. Fairbrother's voice, a tremor that suggested Charlotte had indeed found something. "The threat that went too far. Then why didn't you report her to the authorities?" Graves continued. "Blackmail is a crime, after all." Mrs. Fairbrother bristled. "I am a woman of reputation, Inspector. I don't make a spectacle of myself over nonsense." Miss Marple let out a soft barely audible, but enough to make Mrs. Fairbrother stiffen slightly. The truth was, Mrs. Fairbrother wasn't the type to stay quiet when wronged. She was proud, influential, and always had the last word. So why had she stayed silent about Charlotte's blackmail? Unless there was something truly damaging that Charlotte had threatened to reveal. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes flickered toward Henry Fairbrother, her nephew. Unlike his aunt, Henry looked deeply uncomfortable. In fact, he looked like a man on the verge of panic. "An unexpected confession, Henry, dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly, drawing all attention to him. "You look terribly unwell. I do hope it's not the cider." Henry's head snapped up, his face turning even paler. "What? No, I'm fine." But he wasn't. His hands were shaking. Miss Marple smiled gently. "It must have been rather difficult for you, watching Charlotte so confidently weave her way through the village. She had a way of getting under people's skin, didn't she?" Henry's throat bobbed as he swallowed nervously. Inspector Graves stepped closer. "Henry," he said, voice low but firm, "what was Charlotte blackmailing your aunt about?" Mrs. Fairbrother let out a sharp gasp. "How dare you!" Graves didn't take his eyes off Henry. Well, Henry closed his eyes for a long moment, as though waging a war within himself. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply. "It wasn't about her," he muttered. "It was about me." Miss Marple had already suspected as much. Mrs. Fairbrother went rigid. "Henry, be silent," she hissed. Henry shook his head. "No, Aunt Letitia, it's over." The entire hall had fallen into a breathless silence. "What was she threatening you with, Henry?" Graves pressed. Henry let out a bitter laugh. "The truth." Miss Marple adjusted her lace cuffs. "And what truth would that be, dear?" Henry lifted his gaze to meet hers, and in that moment he looked like a man with a great weight finally lifting off his shoulders. "That I was the one who stole from the church funds." The room erupted into gasps. Miss Marple nodded, almost sympathetically. That explained Mrs. Fairbrother's silence. It wasn't her own reputation Charlotte had threatened. It was her nephew's. Blackmail and desperation. Henry rubbed a hand down his face. "I never meant for it to go that far. I was in debt, and I thought, just once, just a little. But Charlotte found out. I don't even know how. She confronted me 2 weeks ago and told me to pay her, or she'd tell the entire village." Inspector Graves's jaw was tight. "And did you pay her?" Henry let out a short, humourless laugh. "Of course not. I didn't have the money, and I knew she wasn't bluffing. She would have destroyed me. I even begged Aunt Letitia for help." Mrs. Fairbrother's face was stone-cold now. "And I told you what I tell everyone. Fairbrothers do not pay blackmailers." Henry nodded miserably. "So I was left with nothing. I thought my life was over." The entire room was watching him now. And then, Henry whispered, Charlotte was dead. Miss Marple observed him carefully. There was guilt in his voice, but not the guilt of a murderer. The guilt of a man who had considered murder. Inspector Graves eyed him closely. "You had a motive, Henry." Henry looked down at the floor. "I know." "But did you do it?" Henry hesitated. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "No," she said gently. "He didn't." All eyes turned to her. Graves frowned. "What makes you so certain, Miss Marple?" She smiled. "Because Henry isn't clever enough." Henry blinked. "Excuse me?" Miss Marple's voice remained soft but firm. "Poison, my dear boy, is a weapon of precision. It requires planning, careful timing. You are simply too emotional. If you had been truly desperate, you wouldn't have gone to the trouble of poison. You would have done something rash, something foolish." Henry opened his mouth, then closed it, because she was right. "And more importantly," Miss Marple continued, "the person who poisoned Charlotte knew she would drink the water." She turned her sharp gaze across the room. "Which means," she said, "this wasn't an act of fear. This was an act of calculation. Someone who saw an opportunity and took it." A pause. Then she gave a small, knowing smile. "And I believe I now know exactly who that person is." The villagers held their breath. Inspector Graves turned to her. "Miss Marple, are you saying you know who the murderer is?" She nodded, ever so slightly. "Oh, yes," she murmured. "It is all quite clear now." A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows. and in that moment Miss Marple's eyes landed on the killer, the person who had orchestrated it all, the one who had seen Charlotte Simmons as a threat, and had decided to silence her forever. Chapter 8a single raindrop slid down the stained glass window of St. Hilary's Parish Hall, its slow descent mirroring the thick tension in the room. The villagers sat in stunned silence, their breaths held, their eyes locked on Miss Marple. She sat as she always did, calm, composed, watching. But now there was something in her gaze that sent a chill through the air. She had figured it out, and the murderer knew it. The final clue Inspector Graves, his stance firm, turned toward Miss Marple. "You're saying you know who poisoned Charlotte Simmons?" Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Oh, yes, Inspector. It was rather clever, really, but not quite clever enough." A hush spread through the crowd. Even Mrs. Fairbrother had stopped clutching her pearls. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the table of letters. The words Charlotte had written, the threats, the demands, they had painted a picture of a woman who had known too much. But in the end, Miss Marple said, her voice soft yet cutting, Charlotte was not murdered because of what she knew. She was murdered because of what she suspected. Graves frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Eleanor. "Harding." The young woman stiffened, her fingers tightening around the hem of her dress. Charlotte thought she had found the truth, Miss Marple continued, but she was wrong about certain details. She believed Eleanor was having an affair with James Radcliffe, when in fact Eleanor was guilty of nothing more than being a convenient scapegoat. Eleanor let out a shaking breath, relief flashing across her face. "But that does not mean Charlotte was entirely mistaken," Miss Marple went on. "She was right that there was a secret worth killing for, and someone in this room decided to silence her before she could dig too deep." Inspector Graves exhaled sharply. "Who?" The room braced itself. Miss Marple turned slowly, and her sharp blue eyes landed on Dr. Morton. A stunned gasp swept through the hall. Dr. Morton, the village doctor, the very man who had first examined Charlotte's body, stared at her, unblinking. And in that single moment of hesitation, Miss Marple knew she was right. "A calculated murder, Dr. Morton," she said gently. "Would you be so kind as to tell me, where were you when Charlotte drank the poisoned water?" The doctor's face remained eerily blank. "I was in the hall," he said slowly. Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, watching. You always watch, don't you? But you knew exactly when she would go for a drink, and more importantly, you knew exactly how to kill her." Dr. Morton did not move. "Poison," Miss Marple said softly, "is a very particular kind of murder. It is not born of anger, nor is it impulsive. It is a weapon of precision, a weapon of a careful mind." Her gaze never left his, a doctor's mind. The silence was suffocating. Graves stepped forward sharply. "Miss Marple, are you saying—" "That Dr. Morton poisoned Charlotte's drink?" Miss Marple finished for him. "Yes, Inspector, that is precisely what I am saying." A deadly secret. The room erupted in whispers. "Ridiculous," Dr. Morton said, his voice steady. "Why on earth would I kill Charlotte Simmons?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Because she found out about your other patient." A flicker in his eyes, a single beat of hesitation. Miss Marple nodded to herself. Ah, there it is. She turned to the crowd. Dr. Morton has been keeping a very grave secret, one that Charlotte stumbled upon, and he could not afford for her to speak. Graves narrowed his eyes. What secret? Miss Marple clasped her hands together. Charlotte was clever, but she wasn't subtle. She thought she was blackmailing Henry and Mrs. Fairbrother for their indiscretions, but along the way she discovered something far more dangerous. She turned back to Dr. Morton. The truth about how Mr. James Radcliffe really left London. Heads snapped toward Radcliffe. The businessman's face was grim. Miss Marple smiled. Ah, you see, it all makes sense now. Charlotte thought Radcliffe had lost money in business. That was what she told Eleanor. But what she failed to realize was, his business failure wasn't financial. It was medical. Inspector Graves stiffened. Medical? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Mr. Radcliffe wasn't just any businessman. He was a silent investor in a private hospital, and that hospital had a scandal. The room hung on her words. The kind of scandal, Miss Marple continued, that a doctor would do anything to cover up. All eyes were back on Dr. Morton. His jaw was tight now. You were that doctor, weren't you? Miss Marple said softly. You were involved in whatever went wrong at that hospital, and when it collapsed, when Mr. Radcliffe left London in disgrace, you followed, because if anyone connected you to that failure, your career would be over. Graves stared at Morton. You killed her to keep her quiet, he said slowly. For the first time, Morton's expression faltered, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew. She smiled. It's over, Dr. Morton. The unravelling Dr. Morton's breath hitched. He looked from face to face, saw the way the village now regarded him. Miss Marple sighed. I don't believe Charlotte ever knew the full story. She only suspected something was off with Radcliffe's past, but you couldn't take that risk, could you? Her voice was almost sympathetic. You've spent your whole life carefully curating your reputation, but Charlotte, young, careless Charlotte, was about to unravel everything. Dr. Morton's hands curled into fists. You slipped the cyanide into the water, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. Then you watched as she drank it, and when she collapsed, you did what any good doctor would do. She paused. You examined the body and declared there were no immediate signs of foul play. The silence was deafening. Dr. Morton took a shaky breath. Then he laughed, a slow, bitter, defeated sound. Very good, Miss Marple, he murmured. Very, very good. He lifted his hands, surrendering. The villagers stared in horror. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Dr. Morton, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Charlotte Simons. Miss Marple exhaled softly. Another case solved, another truth uncovered. As the constables led the doctor away, the villagers whispered amongst themselves. The storm outside raged on, but within Miss Marple's mind all was quiet. She sipped her tea. Another murder, neatly solved. Another reminder that in a place like St. Hilary, even the most respectable people could hide the deadliest secrets. Chapter 9. The storm had finally passed by morning, leaving behind a village that felt irrevocably changed. The previous night's events had shattered the illusion of St. Hilary's peaceful existence, replacing it with a lingering sense of unease. Word of Dr. Morton's arrest spread like wildfire. By sunrise, there wasn't a soul in the village who hadn't heard the tale of how their trusted physician had poisoned a woman in cold blood. And yet, as Miss Marple sat at her window, sipping a fresh cup of tea, she knew something deeper still lay beneath the surface. Murder, after all, did not happen in isolation. It was the result of pressure, of long-buried secrets, of unseen fractures within the lives of those involved. And this murder had been no different. The morning after at the Rose and Crown, the village's only inn, Inspector Graves sat across from Miss Marple in the breakfast lounge. The scent of buttered toast and fresh coffee filled the air, but neither of them had much of an appetite. "You never cease to amaze me, Miss Marple," Graves admitted, stirring his tea absently. "How did you know it was him?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Oh, it wasn't so much about what he did, Inspector, but rather what he failed to do." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Go on." She set down her cup. When Charlotte's body was found, he was the first to examine her, a doctor, trained in the human body. And yet he declared there were no visible causes of death. Graves nodded. "And there weren't." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "But that's exactly why I became suspicious. You see, a doctor, especially one of Dr. Morton's experience, should have known that sudden, unexplained deaths often indicate poison. But he didn't even suggest it." Graves frowned, realization dawning, because he already knew. "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "He was so quick to dismiss any external injury, any reason for further inquiry. It was subtle, but it was there. And once I realized that, everything else fell into place." Graves let out a deep sigh, rubbing his temple. "And the whole thing with Radcliffe's past? Charlotte may not have known the full truth, but she got close enough that Morton panicked." Miss Marple nodded. The poor girl had no idea she had stumbled into something much larger than a simple village scandal. She was merely digging where she shouldn't, and that was enough to get her killed. Graves leaned back in his chair, looking out the window. Outside, the villagers milled about quietly, still processing the events of the previous night. "Funny thing about murder," he mused. "You always think you know what people are capable of until they prove you wrong." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, Inspector, people prove me right far more often than they prove me wrong." A town forever changed. By midday, Dr. Morton had been escorted out of the village in the custody of 2 constables, his once pristine reputation reduced to whispers and scandal. Mrs. Fairbrother, still recovering from the revelation of her nephew's theft, had retreated to her estate, claiming a terrible migraine. Henry, though free of murder accusations, would have to atone for his crimes. The vicar, Reverend Fanshawe, had agreed to oversee the repayment of the stolen church funds under the condition that Henry dedicate himself to honest work in the village. Eleanor Harding, relieved to have her name cleared, had withdrawn into, herself speaking little of the ordeal. But Miss Marple suspected that, in time, she would recover. And James Radcliffe? He had left before dawn, boarding the first train out of St. Hilary, a man with too many ghosts chasing him. Miss Marple sighed softly. Some people fled from their pasts. Others tried to bury them. But in the end, the past always had a way of catching up, a reflection on human nature. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, the warmth of the fireplace flickering against the walls. She had seen many murders in her lifetime. She had seen greed, jealousy, revenge, all the dark shades of human nature, lurking just beneath the polite smiles of well-mannered society. And yet, each case still saddened her. Charlotte Simmons had played a dangerous game, but she had not deserved to die. Dr. Morton had spent a lifetime maintaining a respectable image, but in the end he had sacrificed it for the sake of a secret. And in the middle of it all, a village that had once seemed so peaceful, now left with the bitter taste of murder, Miss Marple exhaled slowly. People liked to think they knew their neighbours, but Miss Marple had long ago learned the truth. No one ever really knew anyone with that thought. She sipped her tea, gazing out into the night. The storm had passed, but in St. Hilary, the echoes of it would remain for a long time. Chapter 10. The days after the murder of Charlotte Simmons and the arrest of Dr. Morton brought a strange stillness to St. Hilary. The village was trying to return to normal, yet there was an unspoken understanding that things would never quite be the same. The Harvest Festival, once meant to be a joyful event, had become a story that would be whispered about for years. The villagers moved about their routines with forced cheerfulness, as if by baking fresh loaves of bread, arranging flowers, and gossiping about minor village scandals, they could erase the dark stain that murder had left behind. Miss Marple, as always, observed everything from the quiet corner of her sitting room, knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to the latest village chatter. The murder had been solved, but the ripples it had caused were far from over. Final goodbyes. On a grey morning, Eleanor Harding stood at the train platform, a single, small suitcase in hand. She was leaving St. Hilary. Miss Marple, standing a few steps away, watched as Eleanor shifted her weight from foot to foot, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "You don't have to go, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. Eleanor turned, her smile tinged with melancholy. "Oh, but I do, Miss Marple. I need a fresh start." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes a change of scenery is just what one needs. A pause. "Where will you go?" Eleanor let out a soft breath. "I have an aunt in Bath. She's offered to let me stay for a while." "That sounds lovely," Miss Marple said. "But do remember, Eleanor, one cannot run from the past. It follows, no matter how many miles one puts between oneself and it." Eleanor swallowed, nodding. "I know, but I also know that if I stay here, I'll never truly be free from everything." Miss Marple understood. Charlotte's death had left an invisible mark on Eleanor, one she could not simply ignore. As the train whistle sounded, Eleanor turned to Miss Marple with a grateful expression. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, the truth always reveals itself in the end. One only needs to be patient enough to listen." The train doors closed, and Eleanor was gone. A village that never forgets. The weeks passed, and life in St. Hilary slowly resumed its usual rhythm. Mrs. Fairbrother, though still maintaining her airs of superiority, had noticeably retreated from the public eye. Whether from shame or simple exhaustion, no one knew. Henry Fairbrother had been spared prison, but under the watchful eye of Reverend Fanshawe, he had been assigned community service, a humbling punishment for a young man who had once thought himself untouchable. And James Ratcliffe, he had vanished. Some said he had gone back to London. Others claimed he had fled abroad. But Miss Marple suspected he would never return to St. Hilary. The village had seen too much, learned too much, and for a man like Radcliffe, the past was a weight too heavy to bear. As for Dr. Morton, his trial had been set, and the newspapers had begun publishing sensationalized accounts of the crime. "Village doctor turns killer," one headline read. "A poisoner among us," another declared. Miss Marple, reading these, simply shook her head. The truth, she had always known, was far less dramatic than the papers made it out to be. Dr. Morton had killed not out of hatred nor greed, but out of self-preservation. And as always, it had been a foolish mistake. Murderers, Miss Marple knew, were never as clever as they believed themselves to be. A quiet reflection. One evening, as Miss Marple sat before the fire, sipping her tea, she allowed herself a moment of contemplation. She had solved many murders in her time. She had uncovered the darkest corners of human nature, seen the masks people wore, and pulled them away. But even so, she always felt a certain sadness at the end of each case. Not for the murderers, but for those left behind. Charlotte Simons had been a foolish young woman, too confident in her ability to manipulate others. She had been reckless, arrogant, and unkind, but she had not deserved to die. And now her name would forever be tied to a crime, whispered about in drawing-rooms, recalled in hushed tones whenever the harvest festival was mentioned. Miss Marple let out a soft sigh. Murder was not simply an event, it was a wound that left a village forever changed. As the fire crackled softly, she took one last sip of her tea and set her cup down with delicate precision. Life, after all, would continue. New gossip would emerge, scandals would come and go, but Miss Marple knew that behind every cup of tea, behind every polite conversation, there were always secrets, and sometimes those secrets were deadly. The end